On the night of December 24th, 1915, Chicago lay buried beneath a sheet of white snow. The streets along the Chicago River were eerily silent. Only the distant, weary toll of church bells drifted through the thick, frozen air. At the corner of West Randolph, the old warehouse of the Western Electric Company had been reopened, not to store goods, but to store people. The poor, the jobless, and the homeless all sought refuge there, fleeing the bitter cold. Outside, an oil lantern flickered weakly above the door, casting a dim amber glow over a weathered wooden sign that read, "Temporary Christmas Shelter." Inside, the air reeked of damp wood, kerosene, and something else, sharp and briny like dried seawater. The floorboards creaked beneath every step. From between the planks, droplets of water leaked through, staining the wood in dark, irregular patches. The caretaker, Edward Pike, brushed snow off the steps, his calloused hands trembling from the cold. He had once been a sailor and had seen many die on the river. Yet he could never forget that one summer, when this very warehouse had been filled with stretchers draped in white sheets, lined wall to wall. Among those seeking warmth sat a middle-aged woman in the corner. Clara Jensen, widow of a ship engineer. The lamplight glimmered on her pale face as her gaze drifted into the distance, as though still following the black waters of that fatal night. In her hands she clutched a frayed wool scarf, still faintly smelling of salt. When someone passed by, the light caught the fabric, revealing tiny crystalline flecks upon it, like snow, but refusing to melt. Across the room, Father Mallory sat reading his prayer book, the candlelight trembling over his gaunt features. He had been summoned here that same summer, when the warehouse became a makeshift morgue. Each night, he prayed over hundreds of nameless souls, and each morning, he found damp rings around his portable altar, as though the dead had stirred in the dark. Now, returning to this place on Christmas Eve, he felt something watching him, something that did not breathe. The wind howled through the cracks in the door, weaving a sound that almost resembled a song, broken, wavering, and cold. Heads turned. A few children giggled, thinking someone was singing a carol. But Clara froze. She recognized the tune, the same melody played by the band aboard the Eastland, moments before it capsized. The wind carried that ghostly hymn through the rotting beams, blending with the steady drip of cold water beneath the floorboards. By midnight, the temperature had dropped sharply. People huddled in their blankets, struggling for sleep. Edward made his rounds. At the western wall, he noticed the floor swelling, water seeping through. Kneeling down, he lifted his lantern. A bead of liquid touched his finger, ice cold, but not rainwater. It was salty, thick with the scent of the river. He wiped his hand, but the smell clung to his skin. In the dim light, Clara lay awake. Footsteps passed nearby, then silence. When she opened her eyes, the space beside her was empty. The man who had been lying there moments ago was gone. On his blanket, a dark stain was spreading. She leaned closer. The scent of salt flooded upward. Outside, the church bells began silent night. Inside, the lantern sputtered once and died. The wind ceased. No one moved. Only one sound remained, the faint, rhythmic dripping from beneath the floorboards. Steady, relentless. Like the heartbeat of a ship rising slowly from the river's depth. Dawn rose slowly, a frail light seeping through the frost-covered windows of the warehouse. Inside, the cold was dense, heavy, so bitter that every breath turned into white smoke. Some had left during the night, abandoning their blankets and damp belongings. No one mentioned them. No one asked. Silence hung over the place, as though it alone could keep them safe from whatever waited beneath the floor. Edward Pike walked between the rows of shelves. Each step made a wet, muffled sound. The floorboards had darkened, as if a hidden river crept just below, waiting for its moment to surface. He looked around and noticed faint white veins of salt crusting along the walls, spreading like thin mist. No fire had been lit the night before, yet vapor still rose from the floorboards. The air carried the scent of the river, mud, rot, and the faint trace of dead fish. In the far corner, Father Mallory remained kneeling beside the only candle still burning. The weak light trembled across his soaked prayer book. He remembered this place clearly. 3 months ago, he had stood in that very spot when the first body was brought in. They had stacked the dead, men, women, and children, in rows until the wooden floor groaned beneath their weight. White sheets covered them, and through the long nights of prayer, he had heard murmurs rising from below, like voices underwater, struggling to speak. He had told himself it was only the wind. But now, in this cold, those voices had returned, clearer, closer. Clara Jensen sat pressed against the wall, her hands gripping the frayed scarf. Her eyes were red and sleepless. The nightmare from the night before still clung to her, the vision of black water and the trembling lights of the ship swaying in the fog. Among the drowning crowd, she had seen her husband's face, pale and wide-eyed, calling her name through the foam. She had woken to the sound of singing, a faint, formless melody that still echoed in her mind. It was not quite human, not quite music. It was the breath of water itself, slipping through the cracks in the floor, shaping itself into a song. By noon, the snowfall ceased. Light filtered through the window, reflecting on the floor in quivering patterns, like ripples across a lake. Edward went to check the basement. The stairs were slick, each step bending under his weight. The air below was thick, suffocating. He raised his lantern. The wooden walls were blotched with dampness, their surfaces covered in handprints. Dozens of them. They trailed upward from the ground to the ceiling, stopping at the underside of the floor above. Every print was wet, fresh, and dusted with a fine layer of salt. Looking up, he saw droplets of water falling steadily from the seams between the planks. Above him, Father Mallory heard the song again. This time, it wasn't distant. It rose from directly beneath his feet. The sound deepened, joined by faint groans, like hundreds of throats gasping for air all at once. He reached for his crucifix, but the metal was so cold it burned his skin. When he picked it up again, he saw that it was coated in a thin green rust, as if it had just been dredged from the bottom of a river. Clara stood and approached the floor. Water seeped through the cracks, forming a small dark circle. She touched it and felt it move. Beneath the thin wood, something was drifting, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She recoiled, but the chill clung to her fingers, burrowing into her flesh. Outside, the sky turned a dull gray. Inside, every light dimmed. The song below the floor shifted into a drawn-out moan, echoing, then splitting apart into hundreds of overlapping sounds. It was like a choir drowning in unison, voices choking on their own hymn, yet still trying to sing. Then came a sharp crack. A floorboard at the center of the room swelled and split. From the opening, black water surged upward, spreading across the floor, inch by inch, toward the sleeping refugees. The air filled with the stench of salt. And in that rising water, Just for a moment, Clara saw a face. Pale, blurred, eyes open wide, staring up from beneath. Christmas morning, 1915. The snow had stopped, yet the air inside the West Randolph warehouse was as thick as river mud. Moisture clung to every surface. The wooden floor was soaked through, and the stench of salt had seeped deep into the grain. Paint peeled from the walls, revealing the black timber beneath, wet and cold, as though the building itself were breathing the damp breath of the Chicago River outside. Edward Pike was the first to wake. Half the people who had taken refuge were gone. The blankets they left behind were drenched, mottled with pale salt stains. Across the floor stretched a trail of smeared handprints that led all the way to the front door and ended there. No footprints followed. He tried the handle, but the wood was fused tight, frozen in place. When he touched it, his fingertips came away slick with something damp and briny. At the far end of the warehouse, Father Mallory was rearranging his small altar. He lit a new candle, but as soon as the flame caught, it shivered and went out. There was no wind, no breath of life, only the steady dripping sound, slow and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. He looked down and saw a shallow puddle forming on the floor. When he leaned closer, he realized something was wrong with the reflection staring back at him. The face in the water was moving, its lips parting slowly, while he himself remained silent. Clara Jensen sat alone in the corner, the scarf in her hands now dark and heavy. She no longer felt fear, only exhaustion, as if she had been waiting for this moment all her life. In the shadows, she heard a voice calling to her, faint, tender. Her husband's voice, from beneath the floorboards. Each word rose like breath through water. Calm down. Christmas isn't over yet. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was standing once more in the summer river. The water up to her neck, the ship's lantern swaying, the band still playing. Faces drifted around her, pale and glassy-eyed, their open stares glimmering like crystal. Father Mallory lifted his crucifix. The metal was rough, corroded, heavy as stone. He placed it on the altar and whispered a prayer for the dead. His voice shook, fragmented, yet each word echoed through the damp air. Water began to drip from the ceiling, slow, deliberate drops landing upon the open pages of his Bible. The paper bloomed with dark stains, the ink dissolving into swirling veins. A dense, salty mist rose from the text, thick as smoke. Edward heard the crack of splitting wood. He turned. One section of the floor at the center of the room was bulging upward, strained by something pressing from below. He rushed over, knelt, and pressed his ear to the boards. In the darkness he heard murmurs, hundreds of them, merging into a single, enormous exhalation. Not wind, not water, breath. The breath of those who no longer breathed. A sharp report shattered the silence. A plank burst open, and black water erupted upward, spraying like liquid smoke. The torrent struck the last candle and extinguished it. Darkness swallowed the room. Only the sounds remained, the slap of waves, the scraping of unseen bodies, and the suffocating reek of salt filling every lungful of air. Clara rose to her feet. The dim light from the window traced her face. Water now pooled around her ankles. Things floated past in the murky flood. A hat, a torn ticket, a rag of wet fabric. She bent to touch one and felt, unmistakably, the cold skin of another hand pressing back. Father Mallory lifted his gaze and whispered one final prayer. But instead of words, a surge of water burst upward into his mouth, choking him silent. He collapsed. The final lamp fell and shattered. Darkness consumed the warehouse. The water kept rising. And from beneath came the singing again, no longer distant but close, directly below. A warped, mournful hymn tangled with the sound of hundreds of drowning breaths. The floor shuddered. Then, as the last plank split apart, countless wet hands reached upward, searching, trembling, like those of passengers still climbing from a sinking ship, still believing the water above them was the sky. Christmas night drifted by in an eerie silence. Outside, snow fell thick over the buildings lining the Chicago River. But inside the West Randolph warehouse, the floor was no longer solid. It was water. Black, viscous river water had risen to the knees, briny and cold as steel. Things drifted past, splintered wood, a shoe, and nameless debris like the remnants of a ship recently broken apart. Edward Pike stood in the darkness, clutching a damp oil lamp. Its frail light quivered across hundreds of faces rippling beneath the surface. They did not move, only floated silently, eyes wide and glassy, staring upward. When the light passed over them, it seemed they exhaled together, a single breath of chill from the throats of the long dead. In the far corner, Father Mallory knelt, doubled over, clutching his decayed prayer book. The black water circled him, tugging at his robes like unseen hands. He tried to pray, but each word dissolved into the sound of the water, breaking apart like bubbles. Then a hand seized his wrist, cold, soft, and heavy as flesh gone to rot. A face rose next, eyeless, boneless, merely the blurred shape of memory. It drew him downward slowly, as though returning him to the place where he had once prayed 3 months earlier, among hundreds of silent corpses. Edward's lantern trembled. He saw the priest's shadow sink, then vanish beneath the surface. The prayers ceased, replaced by the faint, rhythmic lapping of water, like the oars of an invisible ship. In that moment, he understood that what was flooding the room was not merely water. It was the river's own memory, returning to reclaim what it had lost. Clara Jensen stood motionless by the northern wall, where the flood had first broken through. The dim light caught her face, not in terror, but in something like reverence. Reflected in the water, she saw her husband whole again, a white shirt, a gentle smile, arms open to receive her. Tiny bubbles shimmered around him, like Christmas lights sunk beneath the waves. The water climbed higher, over tables, over chairs, until it reached their waists. Figures began to rise from beneath the floor. Men, women, children, all dressed in soaked garments, skin pale and eyes hollow. None moved quickly. They only walked slowly, quietly, lips parting to release muffled sounds. Not words, but the echo of a final breath, endlessly repeated. The warehouse had become the hull of an overturned ship. Water slapped the walls, timbers moaned, and somewhere deep below, a bell tolled faintly. Edward tried to climb a shelf, but his hand slipped on the wet wood. Another hand gripped his arm, cold, firm, and dragged him down. He struggled. The water filled his mouth, sharp and salty. Amid the chaos, he saw Clara still standing, arms outstretched, as if welcoming someone unseen. The oil lamp flickered out. In the final instant, Edward saw Clara sink gracefully beneath the surface. She reached out, took the hand of the man below her, and together they vanished into the mass of dissolving faces. Then, suddenly, the water receded, swiftly and silently, as though it had never been there. The wooden floor remained dry and cold. The warehouse was empty, save for Edward, collapsed against the wall, gasping, eyes wide and vacant. Outside, the snow kept falling. Church bells tolled through the distance. The air carried the faint scent of salt and a distant murmur, like waves brushing against the hull of a ship. At the center of the room, where the flood had reached its peak, Clara's wool scarf floated, soaked through. Slowly, it sank through a crack in the floorboards, disappearing into the dark below. 4 days after Christmas 1915, Chicago police launched a search along the West River docks. A strange briny odor had begun to rise from the old warehouse on West Randolph Street. Locals reported that on the night of the 24th, they had heard bells tolling and the sound of churning water as if a ship were departing beneath the ground. No one had seen any lights, no footsteps in or out, only snow, falling thick enough to bury the iron doors. When the rescue team broke the lock, they found the interior completely empty. No water, no sign of flooding. Only the damp scent of rust and rotted wood, and streaks of white salt spread across the floor, forming a wide circle the size and shape of a ship's helm. Faint handprints stained the walls, some low to the floor, others high near the ceiling. Each was dry, cold, rimmed with crystalline salt like frost. At the center of the room, they found a notebook, half soaked, its cover printed with the words, "The Eastland Memorial Fund, December 1915. At the bottom was a signature, Edward Pike. None of the rescuers knew who he was. All city records for an Edward Pike, insurance clerk, widower, ended abruptly that December. The newspapers mentioned only a single line, a man presumed missing near the riverbank, believed to have slipped during the snowstorm. When the beam of a flashlight swept across the northern wall, it caught on a small object wedged in a crack of the floorboards, a red wool scarf, frayed and stiff with salt. Embroidered at one end in white thread was a single initial, CJ. No one knew to whom it belonged. The item was sealed and filed under Unidentified Personal Item #47.I. 3 days later, the warehouse was permanently sealed. The deed transfer was suspended. The city claimed the foundation had weakened beyond repair. But every laborer hired to demolish it refused the job. They said that inside, they could hear dripping water though the floor was dry, and the low, metallic resonance of a ship's hull beneath the ground. One worker claimed he smelled seawater, a scent impossible in the heart of a frozen Chicago winter. The following spring, a group of curious journalists visited the docks to write a 1-year memorial piece about the Eastland disaster. As they stood by the river, looking toward the warehouse, a wind swept in from the east, carrying a chill and a faint, distant sound, something like singing. They listened in silence and realized it wasn't a voice at all. It was a bell. 3 short tolls, then 2 long, matching the departure signal once used by the Eastland. No one spoke of the warehouse again. The land was leveled in 1921, turned into a freight lot. But every Christmas Eve, faint ripples could still be heard lapping at the riverbank, even when the surface was sealed with ice. Some delivery drivers swore they saw dim lights gliding beneath the frozen water, as if a ship were sailing upstream, silent and unmanned. They said that if you stand still and listen long enough, you can hear voices, Not clear, not whole. Only breaths, prayers, and muffled words struggling through the deep. And somewhere among them, a man's low, trembling voice reciting the names of the lost over and over. For those who never came home. When the snow blankets the riverfront, the final bell tolls again. Then everything fades into silence. A year later, when the city raised its Christmas tree in the nearby square, a cold wind swept across the docks. Those standing by the river claimed they saw a red wool scarf drift across the ice, suspended for a moment, then slowly sink through. And for an instant, the river echoed once more with the sound of Christmas bells. Low, distant, and warm as the breath of the dead.